Here we are with this position here after black's second move, knight c6. We just looked in the last part about the move pawn to d6. So now what happens if black plays knight to c6? Well, white, of course, once again has ideas like the delayed Sicilian or the Rossolimo with bishop to b5. But what we're focusing on is the open Sicilian after the move pawn to d4. So black once again captures the pawn. Now he has 2 versus 1. Knight takes d4. And now we're going to look at what options he has here on move 4. The main option we're going to look at is the move knight to f6. But let's also consider the moves pawn to g6 and the move pawn to e5. These are all major Sicilian weapons. The move pawn to g6 we can take a look at first. This is the so-called accelerated dragon. It's a little bit like in the standard dragon variation, which we saw in the first part, but the difference is that because here white hasn't actually developed his knight to c3, then what's going on is that white has this new option. He can, of course, play with knight to c3, but he has this new option of going for the move pawn to c4 to try to clamp down on this square d5, really grabbing a bit more space. And this way of setting up is so popular, and it was indeed popularized by a strong Hungarian grandmaster of his time, Géza Maroczy, that it's known as the Maroczy bind. So this is one of the new options that white has after black plays, instead of the regular dragon that's a little bit takes place a few moves later, instead playing the so-called accelerated dragon. Besides this move g6, black can also try the move pawn to e5. Now this move at first sight looks really quite strange, because on the one hand, yes, you're attacking the knight, which makes sense, and placing a pawn in the center, but there are some very serious weaknesses here on the d5 square and on the d6 square. In the early days, black would play like this to play after the move knight to b5, simply kick the knight out with a6, and the knight would jump into this weak square here on d6, after which black would grab the knight, white would capture back, and black would then challenge the white queen with a move like queen f6. The problem with this way of playing the Sicilian was that when the dust settles in this position, black, it turns out, is really missing his dark squared bishop, and so the black player struggled to find complete equality in these positions. A few years later, things started to take a bit of a turn. Let's go back to this position. After the move knight to b5, we have the following position on the board. And players from the black side started to prevent the knight jump to d6 with the move pawn to d6. Now, the d5 square remained weak, and white could further clamp down on it with the move pawn to c4, or could play a move like knight to c3 to try to reroute to this outpost on d5, but the d6 square was under reasonable control. This became known as the Kalashnikov variation, and is quite similar to the Lasker Pelikan or the Sveshnikov variation, which we'll take a look at quite soon. So, in this kind of a position, although white does have more space, especially if he goes for c4 and black's pawn on d6 is backward, it turns out that black's play is quite reasonable here because he still has 2 pawns versus 1 in the center, and white has spent a long time and will continue to spend time moving his knight around. So this gives black some very dynamic possibilities. Sometimes also black can break at the white central pawn via the move pawn to f5. So this is one of the more reasonable Sicilians that you can play, although it's not as common as the Sveshnikov, which bears a resemblance because it has the same structure. We'll see that in a bit. Okay, so that's it for the Kalashnikov. Let's move on to the next Sicilian. So now let's take a look at the Sveshnikov. In the Kalashnikov, we start with e5, and after knight b5, we play d6. So we get this particular structure. However, in the case of the Sveshnikov, we begin with the move knight to f6, strike at the pawn on e4, white typically plays the knight to c3, and now we play the move pawn to e5. White once again jumps his knight to b5, but one of the nice things about playing with the inclusion of the knight moves from a black perspective is that after d6, white no longer has the possibility of going for this spatial bind with the move pawn to c4. So therefore here white's options are somewhat reduced. White actually typically continues either with jumping straight into the outpost, which creates a nasty threat on c7, but black is okay after capturing the knight and then dropping the knight back typically to b8. The other way in which white tends to try and continue is with this move bishop to g5. And beginner level players are really scared to play like this as black because they think, I really don't want to create this weakness, I really don't want to have this backward pawn. But the reason why this opening is generally referred to as the Sveshnikov is because Yevgeny Sveshnikov, a grandmaster, he in the 1970s started to really appreciate the dynamic potential of this variation, and so he started playing it in his tournament games, and it went from being known as the Lasker Pelikan variation to being more commonly known as the Sveshnikov. So what are black's dynamic possibilities here? Well, first of all, much like in the Kalashnikov, white spends quite a lot of time moving this knight away. Now black typically will play the move a6, white often captures here on f6, and black accepts that he cannot take with the queen because knight c7 check would cost him his rook, so black captures with the bishop, and now white drops the knight back to a3, but we see all these knight moves. Black certainly has a weak pawn structure, but white has to once again make a knight move because black's threat is to play b4 and fork a knight. White uses this very strong outpost, this weak square that black has accepted, but black has ideas in this position revolving around his extra pawn. Having captured this way, he has more pawn control in the center, and he also has the two bishops. Specifically, this bishop is unopposed because white has given up his own dark squared bishop. Often, black will play moves like bishop g7 castle and will seek to break with the move f5. And so this kind of a position is really quite an interesting and dynamic position, and it's been played by many world champions over the years, so certainly one of the top tier Sicilians available. This brings to a close our coverage of the Sicilians arising from the second move, knight to c6. If you have enjoyed this video, then please give us a like, and indeed, if you like this type of content, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to see more in-depth coverage of some of the openings covered, and in fact, of a lot of different types of chess strategy and material, please check us out at chessfactor.com, where you'll find all sorts of extensive coverage ranging from beginner level right up to expert level. So hope to see you there.